So, as the United States becomes more powerful, there's this kind of question. Should we be like the European empires? And as we continue on into sections 6 and 7, we will be talking more about the European empires. But for now, I just want to know that they exist, that they're very powerful. And many Americans say, look, we're just as good as those Europeans. Why can't we also have an empire, right? The Europeans are awesome. They have empires. We're awesome too. We should also have an empire. Show everyone how awesome we are. Or should we be on the side of weaker countries, right? We ourselves were once a colony, or rather 13 colonies. Shouldn't we be on the side of countries that want to struggle for their independence? And this is a very serious question that Americans are asking, right? It's a question we have to ask because in the 19th century, we're becoming increasingly powerful. We're becoming an increasingly important role on the world stage. So there's this basic question. Should the U.S. be like the European empires, or should we be on the side of weaker countries? And the answer is we kind of try and do both. We basically become an empire, but say we're a different kind of empire, that we're an empire that stands for freedom and liberty. And as we'll see, there's some kind of problems with that. But Americans, in a sense, we try and have it both ways to say that we're an empire without being an empire. So it's kind of interesting that there, as we'll talk about, we have kind of some amnesia about our empire, right? We've kind of forgotten about it, which is kind of curious. So I think one area to talk about would be the Pacific Ocean, right? That's where we're going to start off first, and then we'll kind of come back to it later. But what's interesting, of course, is that there's this kind of idea in American history of what we call manifest destiny, this belief that the Americans have kind of a mission from God to expand from the east coast of North America to the west coast. And of course, once you're done expanding to the west coast, why stop? Well, let's just keep going. So Americans will keep going, and in particular, they will go really, really far west, all the way to the Hawaiian Islands. And increasingly, American investors will come to dominate the Hawaiian economy. The Hawaiian economy is based primarily around sugar. In this time period, they grow other fruit. They grow fruits and other things as well, but sugar is the big money maker. So American investors are going to increasingly dominate the Hawaiian economy. The Queen of Hawaii, and I will not get her name right, but I'm going to give it a shot, Liliuokalani, is going to try to pass laws to restrain the Americans, to try and make it so that we can't use our economic influence, our growing economic influence, so we can't make it, use it to kind of take over the political system, right? Americans were already using a lot of their economic power to influence Hawaiian politics. And I have to emphasize, Hawaii was an independent country with its own queen. And so she will try and pass laws that will restrain the Americans so we can't get too much economic power, and so that we cannot use that economic power to gain political power. Unfortunately for Queen Liliuokalani, this in a sense is too late. The Americans are already really powerful. So in 1893, Americans, in response to this effort to restrain their power, will just overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and establish a republic. And then, being Americans, they will want to become a part of the United States. So in 1898, they will successfully appeal to the United States to be annexed and to become a territory of the United States. That will not actually become a full-fledged part of the United States until after World War II, right? But you can see we're kind of becoming an empire. The United States, Americans are increasingly looking outside of the continent, in this case into the Pacific Ocean, and expanding our power there, our economic and our political power in this way, right? And this involves, this is to me quite clearly imperialism, right? Americans, even though it's not the American government per se, are going to directly overthrow the legitimate government of a country, establish a new government, and become a part, in a sense, of the United States, or what I should say, the American empire. Another significant part of the growing American empire is the Spanish-American War, which begins in 1898. And looking at this war will help us to better understand not only the American empire, but also the complex relationship the United States has often had with Latin American countries. Now, we have to stress, though, that even though if I was teaching just an American history class, I would focus mostly just on the Spanish-American War part, I may not even mention the fact, or mention only briefly, that this war comes out of the Cuban War for Independence, right? This war comes out of the Cuban War for Independence, which is very closely related to the Spanish-American War. It's because of the Cuban War for Independence that we fight the Spanish-American War. In fact, many Americans, they understand the reason we're fighting the Spanish-American War is because we're intervening on behalf of the Cubans in their war for independence. And I just want to highlight here, looking at this map, first of all, Cuba is really big, right? Even though, I mean, a lot of times we think Caribbean island, you maybe think something small, but Cuba was relatively big. And it's only about 90 miles from Florida, which is, of course, part of the United States. So Americans were very, very concerned with what was going on in Cuba. So what was going on in Cuba? Well, first of all, many Cubans wanted independence, right? They wanted independence. Remember how we had talked about these Latin American revolutions happening in the early 19th century? Those are successful on continental South America, but Cuba will stay a part of the Spanish Empire. And Cubans, much like many people in Latin America, would have wanted their independence. In particular, one thing we have to stress, the remaining Spanish Empire was basically funded by Cuba. So Spain extracted wealth, principally sugar and tobacco, from Cuba in order to support the rest of its empire that didn't make such a profit. So you can understand why Cubans would maybe want to be independent. Hey, this is Cuban wealth. Why is our resources from Cuba being taken to support the Spanish Empire, right? Why don't they stay in Cuba? Shouldn't Cubans, the people born and raised here, shouldn't they be the ones that determine how that wealth is spent, right? Makes a lot of sense. So for political and economic reasons, much of what we've discussed before, the Cubans will rise up against Spain in the year 1895, calling for Cuba to become an independent country. Now, in order to understand the Cuban War for Independence and why it will eventually lead into the Spanish-American War, we need to understand a concept that is called guerrilla warfare. So first of all, guerrilla warfare does not refer to war between primates, like between apes. It's not spelled G-O-R-I-L-L-A. It is spelled G-U-E-R-R-I-L-L-A. That is a Spanish word meaning little. So guerrilla warfare basically means little war, right? And this is a picture of, a painting depicting guerrilla warfare. And this term came out of Spanish resistance to Napoleon, right? So remember, Napoleon invaded Spain, right? And took over Spain and defeated the Spanish regular army. However, Spanish people did not much like having Napoleon's forces around. They were very cruel. They extracted a lot of wealth from Spain. So the Spanish people wanted to resist even though their army had been defeated. So guerrilla warfare typically involves civilian resistance to people who are seen as invaders. And if you look carefully at this image, you'll see the French cavalry being attacked by Spanish civilians, right? The Spanish civilians are armed and are attacking. And you can see they were actually waiting in ambush. If you look up on the top, you can see that there were men hiding on the roofs. They were waiting for the French to come into this town, and then once they were deep enough in, they attack them. If you look on the left, there's even a woman there with a club. So in guerrilla warfare, you typically have what we would call kind of asymmetrical warfare. You have on one side regular uniformed troops fighting civilians who have taken up arms against them, right? So the civilians will pretend to be just average everyday people who are not in opposition to the military. But then when the soldiers are in a weak position, such as marching through a town, like they're doing here, then the civilians will take up weapons and attack them, right? That's guerrilla warfare, right? The civilians are becoming, in a sense, soldiers, but they don't wear uniforms. They attack the military when it seems weak. And it's a very difficult thing to fight against a guerrilla force, right? You're a soldier. How do you determine who your enemy is, right? If they don't wear uniforms, if they're civilians, how do you determine who your enemy is. It's a very difficult thing to do, right? It's a very difficult thing to do. So guerrilla war is very hard to fight, right? Because you don't know who your enemy is. And those civilians who are smiling and treating you nicely during the day, at night, might stab you in the back, might attack you, might kill you. So guerrilla war is very dangerous. Now what happened, the Spanish regular forces quickly defeated the Cuban army, right? The Cubans who rose up in rebellion, who fought openly, wearing uniforms, clearly marked as soldiers, they were defeated very quickly. So the Cubans, though, even though their army had been defeated, still wanted independence from Spain, so they're going to engage in guerrilla war, right? So Cubans will start fighting against the Spanish in this way. They will not wear uniforms. They will pretend to be civilians. When the Spanish are weak, when the Spanish military is weak or not paying attention or at night, then those civilians will take up guns or swords or whatever and attack the Spanish forces. So the problem then with guerrilla warfare, what makes it so difficult, so dangerous to deal with, is that it blurs the line between the soldiers and civilians. You don't know who to fight, right? And traditionally, you don't make war against civilians. So how do you deal with guerrilla war? Well, in a sense, you focus on ways to figure out how to differentiate between soldiers and between civilians. Or at least we could say between hostile civilians and non-hostile civilians. So what the Spanish started doing in Cuba was in areas where there was guerrilla activity, they would take all the people who lived there and force them to leave, right? Where they force them to leave and move into a town or a camp of some sort, what you might call a concentration camp. And I'm using that term, incorrectly. This is what they called them in the time period. Sometimes they call reconcentration camp or something like that if you translate that in English. But the idea is that you concentrate the population that is considered non-hostile, right? You withdraw them. And then in the area that they lived, where there was the guerrilla activity taking place, you say that anyone who's still there is hostile and can be killed, right? So that's how you deal with guerrilla. One way that you can deal with guerrilla warfare is you evacuate the area of all non-hostile or seemingly non-hostile civilians, and then you declare that anyone who is there, who's left because they didn't follow the evacuation order, can be considered enemy combatant and killed like you would any other soldier, right? So the problem, like I said, that guerrilla warfare poses is you can't tell who are the civilians and who are the military, right? So you deal with that by trying to figure out, well, who are the hostile civilians, who are the non-hostile civilians. You remove the people who are non-hostile from a particular area where you're having problems with guerrillas. Then you declare that anyone who's in that area is an active enemy and can be killed, and then you can try and wipe out that guerrilla force there. Now, one thing about this, I do want to stress from a military perspective, this is a fairly effective way of dealing with guerrilla warfare. It doesn't always work, but there are plenty of examples of this working effectively, right? So this is in many ways an effective military strategy for dealing with this difficult style of warfare. However, while this might be military effective, it looks really bad because it causes huge amounts of human suffering. Of course, human suffering on its own is terrible, but this can make it more difficult to win the war because it gets sympathy for the guerrillas. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, typically, what would happen is you would move all these people off their homes, away from their farms, into towns. So here's the thing. A town only had perhaps, I'm just making up numbers. Let's say you have a town of 30,000 people, and you round up the people in the countryside. Now you've got in that town 60,000 people. So you have a town that was designed to have sanitation faculties for 30,000 people, that had water access for 30,000 people, that had food supplies to 30,000 people. Suddenly you doubled the population. So now you're going to have people who aren't going to get enough food to eat. You're going to have people that will not have access to clean drinking water. There will not be enough sanitation capacity. So all this together will mean people will not get enough food to eat. And that's exacerbated by the fact that you just took all the farmers and made them leave their farms to live in the town. People will not have enough food to eat. They will become more vulnerable to disease. Disease will be spread more easily because you don't have as many sanitary faculties. People are going to be poorly fed, lowering their immunity. So a lot of people will die. A lot of people will not get enough food to eat. And on the left image, you see a Cuban boy who is a victim of this, right? He is starving because there's just not enough food to go around because they took all the farmers and they moved them off their farms to deal with the guerrillas. You see on the right to the right of that boy, you see a man surrounded by skeletons. Those are people who died in these concentration camps. And like I said, usually when you think concentration camps, you think of World War II, and we'll get to that later. But I'm using that term on purpose because that was kind of the term they used then, and I think it is what it says it is. It's where they concentrated these populations into camps, and a lot of the people died because, like I said, there weren't enough facilities, there wasn't enough food to take care of them. Something like 200,000 Cubans will die because of these efforts at dealing with the guerrillas. That's a lot of people. And what's also key about this is that people in the United States are really disturbed by this. This is getting into American newspapers. So on the right, you see it says the Cuban mother, and it shows this woman who herself is starving, cradling her starving child. And that kind of cartoon was run in American newspapers. So a lot of Americans are seeing this and know what's going on in Cuba and are really disturbed by it. And what's important to understand then is that while this method of dealing with guerrillas is effective militarily speaking, it makes you look really bad, not to mention the fact that it's killing huge numbers of people. And a lot of people in the United States are disturbed by this. And this comic really shows this and also emphasizes how Americans felt that they had a responsibility to act and were frustrated that their government wasn't doing more. So if you look at the left side of this comic, you can see there's a poor Cuban child, and it says below Spain's 16th century methods, which is saying, Spain is this backwards, barbaric country that isn't truly civilized and is treating these Cubans as if we lived a long time ago. And in that time period, if you look at the little picture, the little like sign above the boy, it says barbarism, cruelty, assassination, murder, right? This is what the Spanish are doing to the Cubans. And you can see the woman reaching out her arms to try and help this poor Cuban boy who's trying to reach back. And of course, she's not able to reach him, and she represents the United States. In this time period, the United States was sometimes referred to as Colombia, and that was represented by this woman that you saw there. And as you can see, we're really close, right? She's almost able to reach out and touch this guy and this kid, and that's just reminding us, Cuba's our neighbor. It's only 90 miles away. And you can see Uncle Sam is up there with his hands tied and with a blindfold, and he's sitting on this kind of fortress. And this indicates that even though the American government has the power to do something about Cuba, we're not doing anything. Who is it that has tied Uncle Sam's hands? It's not clear from this comic, but the idea is someone has. And if we could just untie Uncle Sam, if we could just release the American government, we have the power to help protect these poor Cubans, right? And that would really be the right thing to do. Now, under American popular pressure, the United States government will do something, right? Cuba's right next to us, so it's fairly easy for us to do something. So we send a battleship, the USS Maine, off the coast of Cuba to kind of patrol there and to show the flag and to remind the Spanish, hey, we're keeping an eye on you guys, so you better not do so many bad things to the Cubans. And then early one morning, as the USS Maine is patrolling around Cuba, it blows up. It just explodes. Now, we know currently that this was probably an accident, that there was a problem with the boiler. This is a steamship, and it exploded. It was probably just an accident. But because of the American anger at Spain and because of the cruel kind of tactics that were being used to put down this guerrilla campaign by the Cubans, Americans very readily believed that the Spanish had done this. Right? The Americans believed that the Spanish were behind this, that they had set off a bomb, treacherously attacking the Americans. Right? We like I said, now we know it was probably an accident. In the time period, though, people said, these Spanish are doing these terrible things to the Cubans, so of course they would do this terrible thing to Americans. And so there comes to be a slogan, to hell with Spain, remember the Maine. There's this idea that now the Spanish have attacked us, and this attack on us brings us into unity, into sympathy with the Cuban people. And you can see that clearly in this image. Remember the Maine and don't forget the starving Cubans, right? And they've got on the left, they got a picture of the Maine when it was still before it was had its accident, before the Americans thought it had been bombed by the Spanish. And then you can see on the bottom left the Maine after the bomb, when it's sunk partly into the ocean. And on the right you can see starving Cubans. And the idea is that now we are united together with the Cubans against this enemy, Spain. And this is a newspaper headline from the time period. The spirit of war pervades the breasts of all Americans. Patriotic citizens advocate recourse to arms to wreak vengeance upon Spain for the cruel and cowardly destruction of the Maine, right? So this means war. And I think it's really striking that you have this image of George Washington at the bottom of this headline, right? And on one side that seems kind of weird, because what does Washington have to do with Cuba? But I think the idea is that he fought for American independence. So the idea here, again, is that we should unite with the Cubans against these dastardly Spanish who were denying the Cubans their independence, using cruel methods against us. And when we tried to help the Cubans out, look what they did. They treacherously blew up the Maine. So we need to go to war with them. It is essential for us to understand how war, war against foreigners, can serve domestic purposes. And one thing that's really striking, I think, about the Spanish-American War is how it led to changes in how people understood regional differences among Americans, right? So I have this question, right? What does the Spanish-American War do for Americans? Well, you can see that there's these two men here. We'll come to the girl shortly, but there's these two men here. On the left, you see a man dressed in a gray military uniform, and on the right, you see a man dressed in a blue military uniform. And you can see they're both men who are in their later middle ages. The man on the right in particular looks like he could easily be in his 60s, right? Well, you can maybe guess those are meant to be Civil War soldiers. They probably were actually veterans of the American Civil War. Remember, the American Civil War is fought between 1861 and 1865. The Spanish-American War begins in 1898, so my math's not the greatest, but that would be like 33 years later. So you can think about it, right? Some men who were in their 20s and 30s and even their 40s who fought each other in the American Civil War could still be alive during the Spanish-American War, right? And so they remember a time when Americans fought and killed each other. In fact, they maybe did fight and kill each other. But you can see here, rather than trying to kill each other, they are shaking hands, right? They're shaking hands. So there's this idea here that Americans who had been divided in this Civil War are once again being unified. Unified by what? In their support for Cuba, their support for Cuban independence and liberty and freedom, right? So there's this idea that Americans who at one time had been enemies, killing each other, are being reunified by this vision of liberty and independence, brought together by trying to share this vision with Cuba. In addition, though, and if you're, in a sense, I want to stress, this is meant to be a positive perspective on Cuba, right? Cuba, and you know, is depicted here by a little girl. I don't know if you can read it, but on her crown it says Cuba, and you can see she's raising her hand triumphantly with a broken chain on it, right? So on one side, Cuba is represented by this pretty little girl, and it's free, but there's kind of a problem here, right? If you're Cuban, there's something you may not like about this, right? In terms of gender and age. You're being, the United States, Americans are being presented as grown men. You're being presented as a little girl, right? Americans are mature, masculine, powerful, and they are here to protect this little girl. So if you're Cuban, you may say, well, we're glad that Americans want to support us, but we're not little girls who can't take care of ourselves. We're a mature group of people who are fighting for our independence. So even in this effort to kind of present Cuba in a positive way, we can see kind of a problem, right? Cuba is a little girl, needs to be protected, needs to be taken care of, whereas we Americans, we're mature and responsible, and so we're the ones that should do the protecting. And of course, little girls should listen to their elders, right? There's kind of a power relationship here. And you can see this theme, especially here, where you've got Uncle Sam leading the little Cuban boy away from the Spanish alligator or crocodile. I can never remember which is which. But it's saying that wicked man is going to gobble you up, my child. The poor Spain, representing the old world, is sad and crying, but it can't do anything thanks to the protection of Uncle Sam. And again, this is meant to be positive. That's a cute little boy that represents Cuba, right? It's meant to be positive. He's not, and he is studious. He's carrying his books. But there is still a problem. He's being represented as a child who needs the protection and guidance of Uncle Sam, the United States here. He needs schooling. That's what the books represent. And one thing I think it's really striking about this cartoon, if you look closely at the little boy's feet, his shoe is untied, right? You know, poor Cuban kid can't even keep his shoes tied, needs a good parent like Uncle Sam to take care of things. So like I said, on one side, you can see that Americans really do have a positive image of Cuba, want to help Cuba, but there's a problem in that our image, in a sense, infantilizes Cuba, makes Cuba into kids, and that's going to cause problems in our relationship. Moreover, I have to point out that there's kind of divisions among American people, right? So whereas most, not all, but most white Americans were unified by the Spanish-American War, saying, yeah, we need to do something about Spain, right? The vast majority will say this is a war that we should fight. We should fight to help the Cubans against those dastardly Spanish who were so, evil as to attack us and to do these cruel things to the Cubans. That united white Americans. However, African Americans had differing responses to the war, right? So, for example, some African Americans said, how can we talk about bringing liberty and freedom to the Cubans when we ourselves do not have liberty and freedom, right? How can we Americans talk about bringing freedom and independence to these Cubans when we African Americans do not have freedom, right? There's a Latin saying, you can't give what you don't have, right? So how can the United States give freedom when Americans, African Americans in particular, are denied freedom at home, right? This is a time of segregation, of Jim Crow laws, of lynching, their systematic, suppression or oppression of black people in the United States. And African Americans are often denied their rights. So how can we talk about bringing freedom to the Cubans? On the other side, you have African Americans who say, we need to participate in this war. We need to volunteer. We need to fight for Cuba and for the United States to prove that we are good Americans, that we are patriotic Americans, and we deserve our rights, right? We need to prove that we are members of the American nation who are going to do their part, who are patriotic and deserve the rights that are being denied us. And both those, I think, are very reasonable responses. Both of them are perfectly logical. But you can see, again, where there's a kind of division, right? Whereas white Americans may be unified by this wars, African Americans, black Americans will have serious differences. Just as a quick aside, one of the most important, African American units that will fight in this war became known as Buffalo Soldiers, these kind of black cavalrymen. If you like reggae, Bob Marley made a song called Buffalo Soldiers, which is really good. You should totally listen to it. So the Cubans are understandably a bit nervous about the Americans becoming involved because, if we have this kind of image of the Cubans as children who need protection, who need guidance, maybe that means that we'll kick out the Spanish and then we'll just take Cuba as our colony, right? And, that would not be good for the Cubans because instead of having a colonial master that's across the ocean, they would have a colonial master who's only 90 miles away. So the Cubans are nervous about this. And so the United States Congress, after we declare war on Spain, will pass what's called the Teller Amendment that promises that the U.S. will not annex Cuba. Right. So that's, from the Cuban perspective, is a good thing. We promise that we're not going to take over Cuba. We will ensure its independence. Now, what happens then, especially if you look at this from the American perspective, is the American forces show up in Cuba and just run right over the Spanish military there. I mean, there's some hard-fought battles, but it's pretty much over before it began in a sense. It's just not that difficult for the Americans to defeat the Spanish because the Spanish have been trying to fight the Cubans for 3 years. They're tired. They're low on supplies. The Americans are fresh, and there's a bunch of us. So we have a more modern army, so we just are very quickly able to overrun the Spanish. And this is kind of causes this very complex relationship between the American and Cuban armies, because of course the Cubans, they've been fighting a guerrilla war. They are tired. They're also exhausted. And they're wearing rags instead of uniforms a lot of the time. And again, these Americans show up. We're powerful. We've got good uniforms. We're well equipped. We're well armed. We defeat the Spanish in just basically a few months, whereas the poor Cubans have been fighting for years and were not able to defeat the Spanish. So this power differential is very clear. And in a sense, we kind of hijack the Cuban Revolution, right? The Cubans don't win independence on their own. They've been fighting the Spanish, are not able to win, and then the Americans swoop in and defeat the Spanish. And to give you a sense of this power differential, and you can see how it causes problems, when the Spanish surrender, they insist on surrendering to the Americans. They will not surrender to the Cubans. And when the Spanish surrender, they do not even want any Cuban representatives at the formal surrender. And the argument is that if Cubans attend the ceremony for surrender, they might get too excited and riot and attack Spanish people. And I mean, how could this be any more insulting if you're Cuban? I mean, goodness gracious. Not only are you not allowed to attend the surrender, the moment that in a sense marks your independence, you're told that the reason you can't attend the surrender is because you're basically barbaric and uncivilized, and you may get excited and attack Spanish people because apparently you have no discipline. Right. So this is just insulting to the poor Cubans. And you can kind of see how this gets into, this becomes legal, this power differential, because in the Cuban Constitution, the Americans make sure that something called the Platt Amendment is inserted, right? So we're now talking about the Platt Amendment. You need to tell the Teller Amendment and the Platt Amendment apart. The Platt Amendment is a part of the Cuban Constitution that says the U.S. has the right to intervene in Cuba if the Cubans ask for it. We can't just intervene on our own, but they have to ask for it. But that is in their Constitution. And the American Constitution doesn't say anything about the Cubans being able to intervene in our country if we ask for it. So this shows this kind of unequal relationship. And it also gives us the right to establish a base in Cuba. You may ask, why does the Americans have a base in Guantanamo Bay? That's, in a sense, why. So this emphasizes this kind of unequal situation where even though Cuba is legally independent, the U.S. still has a lot of influence there. And I think this is just kind of illustration that shows why there can be a difficult relationship between the United States and Latin America, right? Americans, we did intervene positively, right? We helped the Cubans get their independence, but we kind of steal the show. And we see ourselves as these heroic figures who come in and help, and we do, but we don't recognize how that causes us to view the Cubans as, like I say, like basically like children who need guidance. And so that causes that kind of superiority complex that Americans can easily have, can rub people the wrong way and make relations with our neighbors, particularly our neighbors in Latin America, very difficult. And that's something we have to kind of keep in mind when we're dealing with current events as well as as understanding this history and the rise of the American empire.